Hello out there in Radio Land. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner, the podcast where we don't go to men's retreats because we don't believe in retreat. In fact, our very motto around here is never retreat, never surrender. Well, if you're listening to this on the 17th of March, you should know, the day that it posts, you should know that your intrepid street preacher companion and his partner, the legendary Darnell G. Robinson, are probably, as you hear this, we're on the streets of Savannah, Georgia, preaching to an occasionally unruly mob. It is one of our big annual events, and it's one we've been doing for something like 16 or 17 years. And it sounds like a really long time when you say it out loud. But because it's St. Patrick's Day, I figured now is as good a time as any to talk about our old buddy Patrick. Now, friend, I don't know the nice way to tell you this, but pretty much everything you know about St. Patrick is a fable. A popish fable for the most part, but a fable nonetheless. Now, maybe you've heard how he introduced Christianity to Ireland. Maybe you've heard how he drove the snakes out of Ireland. Maybe you've seen like stained glass windows with him wearing one of those big funny pointy hats that all the high dollar Catholics are so fond of. Maybe you've heard how he used shamrocks to explain the Trinity. You know, VeggieTales even went with that one, which kind of surprised me because after all, if you can't get the truth from Bob the Tomato and Larry the Cucumber, if you can't trust VeggieTales, well, my goodness, the very Republic's in danger. Who can you trust? Anyway, what you have in Patrick is very scant local evidence, and in its place, what you have is centuries of legends and lore and like I said before, popish fables and mythology. The Bible says we do not follow to cunningly devised fables, and so we intend to root out fableness wherever we find it here at the Street Preacher's Corner. But for example, it's a common belief when we talk about St. Patrick, as I've said before, that Ireland was like this barren wilderness of paganism, and obviously that is in its history. It's got historically, Ireland was a place of druidism and nature worship and sprites and spirits and fairies and brownies and all that kind of European stuff. But the teaching is, the common belief is that Ireland was this wilderness, like everybody was this pagan, until Patrick walks into town, with a pointy hat, a pocket full of shamrocks. But the truth is, not so much. For example, Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea and a church historian of some note, reports in his Ecclesiastical History, which is a really long book that covers the time before Eusebius was born, and then up to, obviously the things he witnessed himself, including some interesting accounts of some martyrdoms. But in his Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius said that according to the records he had found in the library of Caesarea, the apostles themselves had, quote, crossed over the sea to visit, what we would now call the British Isles, which include Ireland. Also have Gildas, a British historian from the 6th century. He found evidence of gospel preaching as far back as 61 A.D. Cardinal Baronius, he put it even further back at 35 A.D. Now think about that for a second. I mean, we throw these numbers around, whatever. But think about it. Before the book of Acts was even finished, if these accounts are true, and I have no reason to think they're not, for reasons I'll get into in a minute. But before the book of Acts is even finished, Ireland has some sort of gospel witness, maybe even a visit from an apostle or two. Now, to compare that to the story you've been told is that they were all sitting around in darkness until Patrick shows up. Well, it's just not true. A guy named H.J. Mason wrote a book called the Religion of the Ancient Irish Saints, and it's really quite a book. I'm surprised it didn't get more traction among church history types. But anyway, in his book, Religion of the Ancient Irish Saints, which is available, I think I found a digital copy on Google Books or something. Anyway, he found evidence of not only gospel preaching before Patrick, but actual Bibles in the common tongue as early as 400 A.D. So that's 5th century. That's pretty far back. Mason also says that the gospel was introduced into Southern Ireland by a guy named Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus was a bishop of Lyons in France, and Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who you may remember if you studied martyrdom at all. He's a guy that got burned alive. But he was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. So very quickly, if you just follow that out, you've got a Christian witness in Ireland within less than 2 generations of the completion of the New Testament. So that's pretty early. That's earlier than North America got it. But as if that wasn't enough, you can say, well, Eusebius wasn't there; he was drawing from earlier sources, and Irene Mason is drawing from earlier sources. We have some eyewitness accounts. Tertullian wrote this in 200 A.D. Quote: "Those parts of the British Isles which were unapproached by the Romans were yet subject to Christ." And you have this guy Chrysostom, the Greek historian. He wrote in 388 A.D. Quote: "Although thou shouldst go to the ocean and those British Isles, there shouldst hear all men everywhere discoursing matters out of scriptures with another voice, not another faith." So according to this guy, Chrysostom, you could go along the shoreline and hear the gospel being preached from the shoreline. So that's interesting, and he's got that going back to, he wrote that in 388 A.D. So obviously whatever happened before him. But I will go a little further though, and this is not going to be a super long episode, but I'll go a little further here. My own research, I draw heavily from H.J. Mason's books, and then there's a book by Albert Newman called The Manual of Church History, and there's a book from R. Steele Nicholson. He has a book called St. Patrick, Apostle of Ireland in the 3rd Century. By the way, this is my commercial for the value of reading old books, and there's nothing like it. If you get a book on church history written before in the mid 1800s, that's where the goods are at, because they're drawing from earlier sources, and then sometimes you can find those earlier sources and go back as far as you can. But anyway, so I've done this research, drew from Mason's stuff, drew from Newman's church history, drew from Nicholson's book, and I think that from my research, I will say that most of the works and the dates that are attributed to Patrick really belong to a guy named Palladius, and I'll tell you why. If you take the dates where they give credit to Patrick for doing such and such thing on such and such year at such and such place, and you overlay those with the life of a guy named Palladius, who really was a Catholic bishop and a papal stooge, what you realize is that Palladius did those things and not Patrick. And I'll tell you why that's okay. So Palladius shows up, for example, in Ireland in 432 A.D., 60 years old, ordained by Pope Celestine. I mean, the guy had the pointy head and everything. He was put out there by the Pope to go establish a beachhead of Catholicism in Ireland in 432 A.D. But the real Patrick, at least in my research, and Mason's research, and Newman's research, and Nicholson's research, predates Palladius by about 200 years. So the real Patrick, by his own testimony, was the son of a Roman magistrate and is living in Britain, Briton, Britain. Britain's a strange place in that it has these names that it has gathered. It's called Britain, it's called England, it's called the United Kingdom, it's called all these different names that it has for the same place. And they're all sort of, the Anglos and the Saxons, and then they married, became the Anglo-Saxons, and all this big mixing, melting pot of all the people that conquered that little chunk of dirt over the years, and they all named. Anyway, so the real Patrick is he's the son of a Roman magistrate living in Britain, and there was a raid in 240 A.D. And his family suffered in that raid. Most of his family died. And he was 16 years old. He was kidnapped. He's taken over to the shores of Killale Bay in County Mayo in northwest Ireland. And while he was there, he was put to work tending sheep, far from home and alone in an utterly alien land. In fact, I've got a quote from Patrick. Patrick says, "After I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep, and many times a day I prayed. The love of God and his fear came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened. My spirit was so moved that in a single day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and almost as many in the night. And this even when I was staying in the woods and in the mountains, and I used to get up for prayer before daylight, through snow, through frost, through rain, and I felt no harm, and there was no sloth in me, as I now see, because the spirit within me was most fervent." See, Patrick wrote some things. Anyway, He wrote a thing. He wrote a book called, or not a book. He wrote a writing called Confessions of Patrick, and then we have an epistle that he wrote to a guy. So we have a little bit of firsthand accounts from him. But anyway, 6 years later, after 6 years after being kidnapped by pirates and being sold into slavery, and forced to tend sheep, 6 years after that he escapes, and he escapes through Scotland, and he eventually makes his way back to Bretagne. He doesn't have a whole lot of family left because of the pirates and everything. He was discipled under some Greek missionaries. He was ordained to the ministry in Gaul, and he announced it was God's will that he returned to Ireland to preach. He was going to go preach to the very people who had enslaved him. And he did that. He arrived in Ireland in 252 AD, as opposed to 432 AD, which is what the Roman Catholic says. So we know that. And it's fair to ask what sort of preacher he was. There was a guy named Secundius, I think it's his name. He was the disciple of Patrick's and probably his nephew. He said, quote, he was a true and eminent cultivator of the evangelical field whose seeds appear to be the gospel of Christ. As I mentioned before, Patrick wrote a confession, basically his testimony, talks about his time in Ireland and what they did and everything. He wasn't, obviously wasn't the first guy in Ireland to preach the gospel, so he worked with some other fellows that were there. He also wrote an epistle to a believer called Coroticus, which I guess is in that song, I am the very model of a modern major general. I guess that's I will tell you every detail of Coroticus' uniform. Or maybe that's somebody else. Coroticus. In the confession that he wrote, in the epistle to Coroticus, he doesn't mention Mary or the sacraments or the Pope. He appears to be completely oblivious to the teachings of Rome, as opposed to the Rome says that he was the mainstay of the faith. Instead of talking about Mary and the sacraments and the host and the Eucharist and all that stuff, he says things like, quote, I was as a stone which lies in the deep mire, and he who is mighty came and took me out of it in his mercy. He indeed raised me up and placed me on top of the wall. That's pretty cool. Something else. Jocelyn, who's another person, was writing in the 12th century, said that Patrick, quote, read and interpreted the four Gospels at certain seasons for 3 days and 3 nights continually among the people. Now, it's easy to read that and just let it blow over your head, but you got to, if the timeline that I think and that I've come up with and other people that I've borrowed heavily from, if that timeline is right, and Patrick is in the 3rd century and not the 5th century, like the Catholic Church teaches, it means a couple of things. It means that the people of Ireland had all 4 Gospels in the 3rd century, which is tremendous. That is huge. One of the criticisms you get among people, I'm straying off my notes terribly, but if you've been listening to this for any length of time, I have a hard time staying on topic because as I'm talking other things that I've read about and research are, bouncing around inside my head. But one of the things the skeptics will say is that that the gospel accounts are later products of a later age. Some people say even the 3rd and 4th century. Well, if the people of Ireland, if Patrick had a copy of all 4 Gospels that far back, then those Gospels must have existed that far back. And so that's pretty cool. But the other thing that's really cool is, according to Jocelyn's testimony, our old buddy Patrick, he was a street preacher, says that he continually read and interpreted the 4 Gospels among the people. So there's that. So Patrick died in 310 AD after about 60 years of ministry, and he was pretty legendary by then. I mean, apparently he was quite the fellow, and he was one of those guys that had been around so long that he was a legend. And so people began to write books about him. And by the 9th century, so 600 years after he dies, there's over 66 biographies had been written about him. And if you don't know who Edmund Gibbon is the gold standard for historians just about. Edmund Gibbon wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it is a tremendous resource for anything about that part of the world. The guy just digs down, and he wrote it in the 1860s, with no internet, no Wikipedia, from original sources. Edmund Gibbon is I've never figured out if the guy's saved, but he is definitely well informed about things. And Edmund Gibbon, talking about all these biographies that have been written about Patrick, he said these biographies contained many thousands of lies. So there's that. Okay, so okay, Mike, you've made your point. The Gospels around Ireland before Patrick, and Patrick didn't get there in the 400s. He got there in the 200s, and so how in the world? And there's other guy named Palladius. He did some stuff for the Papal See, and he got Patrick got credit for all his stuff. Not that Patrick would have wanted it, but he got it. Okay, Mike. So how did this all get turned around? Well, how did Patrick, poor Patrick, how did he get swapped out with Palladius? Well, there's two main reasons mainly, and honestly, both these reasons deserve more attention than I'm going to give them. I'm just going to sort of hit the high points. The short version of the first reason is that our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory, when they finally got it sort of settled out, our calendar is a terrible mess. Really, you look at the reason, you can go into all this stuff about why the calendar is all messed up, and the reason some months have 31 days and some months have 30, and February has 28 sometimes, and all this stuff, all these adjustments that were made, and there's this whole thing about how who should celebrate Easter and when they should celebrate Easter, and because of all this confusion and because of all this spread out when Rome was kind of running the world and had a lot more influence over modern or everyday life than they do now. All that was going on. We weren't keeping track of leap years for a long time, and we weren't, but every once in a while, the Pope or the King, being pressured by the Pope, would just start the calendar over. I mean, it happened a handful of times. We're not even 100% sure how many times it happened, and every time it happened, you lose a couple of months, you lose a year, you lose a decade, whatever. And you do this several times over and over again, and now pretty soon you've lost all kind of time. Now, I'm not ascribing to the theory that the Middle Ages never happened and that there's a big gap in the calendar, but I will say that when we say it is 2023, we mean this is 2023 years since the birth of Jesus Christ. But we don't really know how long ago that was because, when you keep changing how many years have passed, you keep adjusting those numbers up and down to suit your own purposes, then you wind up in a big mess. So that's part of the reason, is that the reason that Palladius and Patrick got all mixed up is because nobody knew what year it was. So there's that. The second reason is that the Irish were particularly susceptible to raids from the Norwegians and the Danes. And so these Viking sort of fellows, they would just show up in their longboats and raid the place. And they did that for centuries. It's hard to build something. It's hard to make something last when at any given moment some blonde-haired, blue-eyed guys are going to show up in longboats and burn the place to the ground. But one of the things that's particularly interesting about the Norwegians and the Danes in their repeated invasions that went on for generations and generations and generations is that they did not have a written language. And so because they did not have a written language, they were very suspicious of books. And so when they would roll into town in their longboats, one of the things they would do is they would burn all the books they could find. So you don't have hardly any Bibles from back then. You don't have hardly any records of all from that back then. And that goes on for hundreds of years until they stopped doing it. And by that time, the Catholic Church had a very, very firm beachhead in Ireland. And she was able to control the narrative and claim old Patrick as one of her own. So because of the calendars being all messed up, and because of the occasional Vikings burning everything to the ground thing, almost everything we know about that period of time is from records that were taken out of Ireland and taken, for example, to the library at Caesarea, where Eusebius would read them centuries later. That almost everything we know about that period of time is from records that were exported out of the country, out of the land. So you don't have a whole lot of local stuff to hang on to. And when you have that vacuum and you have a guy that's a legend and nobody knows what year it is, and you have a bunch of illiterate Catholic superstitious peasants, it's not that hard for things to get turned around. It's not that hard for things to become difficult. So in conclusion, Patrick was not a papist. He was not a Catholic bishop. He did not teach Catholicism. He did not teach the errors of Rome. And although he was a remarkable fellow, the thing that's most remarkable about him is he served a remarkable God. So if you really want to, on this St. Patrick's Day, or whenever you're listening to this, if you really want to commemorate the life of St. Patrick, probably the least appropriate way you could do it is by going to a morning mass. Probably the least appropriate way you could do it is to drink so much green beer that you wet yourself and you throw up and you wind up in a back alley, in what you hope is your own vomit. That's probably the least appropriate. That's probably the method in which old Patrick would have approved of the least. If you really want to commemorate the life of St. Patrick, if you want to honor the memory of the patron saint of Ireland, here's what you need to do. You need to go out and preach the gospel to somebody, because that's what Patrick did. If that's what you want to be like Patrick, that's what you need to do. Well, as always, this is Michael signing off. I will see you on the other side. Kind of short this time, but I think it worked.